In 1975, on a street corner outside a liquor store in New York City, a man stood with his dog and waited for a stranger to give him $25. He needed the money for food. He had no other way to get it. The dog's name was Butkus, a bull mastiff he had raised from a puppy, the one companion who had been with him through every cold apartment, every rejection letter, every night when the city felt like it had been built specifically to keep people like him out. He handed the leash to a man he had never met and walked home alone. He cried the entire way. His name was Sylvester Stallone. And what almost nobody knows about that moment, the part that stops you when you hear it, is that 3 weeks later, he was sitting across a table from producers who were offering him $350,000. And he turned it down. Think about what it takes to turn down $350,000 when you have just sold your dog for $25. Not the version of courage that sounds clean in a speech, but the real version, the kind that lives in the body of a man who has already given up the thing he loved most just to eat, and is now being handed the chance to never go hungry again. Sylvester Stallone had spent years in New York being told, in various ways and by various people, that his face was wrong, his voice was wrong, his look was wrong, that whatever it was he was trying to become, the industry had already decided it did not need him. He had cleaned lion cages. He had worked as a movie theater usher. He had written scripts that nobody wanted to read. And by the time he sat down in a cold apartment in 1975, with very little left to lose, and wrote a screenplay in 3.5 days about a man nobody believed in who refused to go down, he was not writing fiction. He was writing the one true thing he had left. What the producers who offered him $350,000 could not have understood, what nobody around Sylvester Stallone fully understood in that moment, was that the screenplay was not a product. It was not a piece of intellectual property to be sold to the highest bidder and handed to a more bankable face. It was him. Every rejection he had absorbed, every cold night he had endured, every moment he had spent being told he was not enough. It was all in that script, in the character of Rocky Balboa, in the idea of an ordinary man who simply refused to accept that his best was already behind him. And Sylvester Stallone was not going to sell that for any price. Not because he did not need the money, but because some things are worth more than the price being offered. And knowing the difference, in the moment when everything in your life is telling you to just take the check, is the lesson that lives at the heart of this story. Before we go further into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if stories like this move you, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we uncover next on The Silent Fortunes. His name was Sylvester Stallone. And before we go any further into what he built, let us be honest about where he was standing when this story begins. He was not a young man with his whole career ahead of him and time on his side. He was pushing 30. He had been in New York for years, collecting rejections the way other men collect regrets, quietly, privately, with no clear sign that any of it was ever going to change. He had sold his dog for $25. He had a screenplay that producers wanted badly enough to put $350,000 on the table for it. And he had said no. Not because he did not understand what $350,000 meant to a man who could not afford food. He understood exactly what it meant. He said no anyway. So how does a man in that position, no money, no career, no safety net, and a dog he had just sold to a stranger on a street corner, find the clarity to turn down the kind of money that would have ended every immediate problem he had? What was Sylvester Stallone carrying inside him during those years in New York that nobody around him could see clearly enough to take seriously? And what happened in the weeks after he walked away from that offer? The weeks when most men would have been lying awake wondering if they had just made the worst decision of their lives. That changed absolutely everything. Those are the questions at the center of this story. And the answers are going to say something important about the difference between a price and a value. And why knowing the difference, in the moment when everything is telling you to just take the check, is the most important decision any man will ever make. Sylvester Stallone was born on July 6, 1946, in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of New York City, a place that, at the time, had a very specific and very unforgiving idea of what a man needed to be in order to survive it. His birth was difficult. Forceps used during the delivery severed a nerve, leaving the left side of his face partially paralyzed. The drooping lip, the slurred speech, the distinctive look that would follow him into every casting room he ever walked into and become the first reason most directors used to show him the door. He did not grow up with stability. His parents separated when he was young, and Sylvester Stallone spent his childhood bouncing between his mother in one place and his father in another, never fully belonging to either world, carrying the particular loneliness of a child who does not have a fixed place to come home to. He was difficult in school, got into trouble, changed schools repeatedly, and arrived in early adulthood with very little formal foundation and a face that the world had already decided was a liability. He moved to New York City in his early 20s with one specific intention. He was going to become an actor, not because anyone around him thought that was a reasonable ambition, not because the industry had given him any reason to believe it would work out, but because it was the one thing he could not stop wanting. And Sylvester Stallone had already learned early in life that the things you cannot stop wanting are the only ones worth chasing. The rejection started immediately and never really stopped. Casting directors told him his face was wrong. His voice was wrong. The slurred speech that came from the nerve damage at birth, the thing he had no control over, the thing that was simply part of who he was, became the most common reason given for closing a door in his face. He worked whatever jobs kept him in the city and close to the industry. He cleaned lion cages. He worked as an usher in a movie theater, watching other people's dreams play out on a screen while his own waited in the dark. By 1975, Sylvester Stallone was living in a small apartment in New York with a bull mastiff named Butkus and very little else. He had appeared in a handful of small roles that had led nowhere. He had written scripts that nobody wanted to read. He was nearly 30 years old, could not afford to heat his apartment, and had no clear sign that any of it was ever going to turn into anything. And then, one night, he watched a boxing match. Muhammad Ali, the greatest fighter alive, against Chuck Wepner, an unknown club fighter from New Jersey who most people expected to last no more than a few rounds. Wepner lasted 15 rounds. He was knocked down, bloodied, and outmatched in almost every technical sense, and he kept getting up. Something about that fight struck Sylvester Stallone so deeply that he could not stop thinking about it long after the final bell. Not the boxing, not the spectacle, but the man. The ordinary man who had no business still being standing, who refused to go down long past the point where going down would have been completely understandable. Sylvester Stallone saw something in Chuck Wepner that night that he recognized, and he went home and started writing. The apartment was cold. Sylvester Stallone could not afford to heat it properly, and by the winter of 1975 he had reached the kind of broke that stops being a temporary condition and starts feeling like a permanent address. Not the romantic broke of a young man with his whole life ahead of him and time to figure it out, but the specific, heavy broke of a man pushing 30 who has been trying the same thing for years with nothing to show for it, whose body is starting to understand what his mind has been refusing to accept. He had Butkus, the bull mastiff he had raised from a puppy, who had been in every cold apartment with him, who had been the one constant presence through every rejection, every closed door, every night when the city felt indifferent and the dream felt like something only a fool would still be holding on to. And then came the morning when Sylvester Stallone looked at what he had left and understood that he could not afford to feed both of them. He took Butkus to the liquor store on the corner. He stood outside and waited for a stranger to offer him money for his dog. A man gave him $25. Sylvester Stallone handed over the leash, watched the man walk away with the one companion who had never once looked at his face and found something wrong with it, and walked home alone. He cried the entire way, not quietly, not with the controlled grief of a man keeping himself together, but with the full weight of everything those years had cost him pressing down at once. Because it was not just a dog. It was the last thing he had given up that he had not already been forced to give up. Everything else, the stability, the certainty, the reasonable life that the people around him had quietly suggested he consider, he had already let go. Butkus was the last of it. The world around Sylvester Stallone at this point was not neutral. It was not simply indifferent to what he was trying to build. It had a clear and consistent message for him, that the window had closed, that the face and the voice that had been problems at 22 were still problems at 29 and always would be, that a man who could not pay his heating bill and had just sold his dog for $25 was not a man on the verge of something. He was a man who had not yet accepted what was already obvious to everyone around him. The shame of that specific position, of being a grown man who cannot provide even the most basic necessities for himself, who has staked everything on a conviction that the people closest to him do not share, is a weight that most people carry in complete silence. Sylvester Stallone carried it through every day of those years in New York. And just when it seemed like there was no way out, something shifted. 3.5 days. That is how long it took Sylvester Stallone to write the screenplay for Rocky. He sat down in that cold apartment, with the memory of Chuck Wepner still in his mind. The ordinary man who had no business still being standing, who kept getting up long past the point where staying down would have been completely forgivable. And he wrote. Not carefully, not with the calculated precision of someone trying to produce a commercial product, but with the urgency of a man who has finally found the one true thing he has been trying to say and understands that this may be his last real chance to say it. He wrote Rocky Balboa the way he knew Rocky Balboa, from the inside, from the specific emotional world of a man who has been told repeatedly and by everyone that he is not enough, and who has decided, quietly and without asking anyone's permission, that he is not going to accept that verdict. He brought the script to producers at United Artists. They read it and they loved it. Not politely, not with the cautious enthusiasm of people managing expectations, but immediately and genuinely. They offered him $25,000 for the rights. Sylvester Stallone said no. They came back with $100,000. He said no again. The number climbed to $175,000, then kept climbing, until the offer sitting on the table in front of a man who had sold his dog for $25 3 weeks earlier was $350,000. A number that would have ended every problem he had. A number that would have heated the apartment, bought back Butkus, and given him the kind of financial breathing room he had not had in years. And Sylvester Stallone looked at that number and turned it down. Because there was a condition attached to every offer. He could have the money, any amount of money, it was becoming clear, but he could not star in the film. United Artists wanted a name. They suggested Ryan O'Neal. They suggested James Caan. They wanted a face that the industry already recognized, a voice that did not slur, a presence that fit the conventional idea of what a movie star was supposed to look and sound like. And Sylvester Stallone, sitting across from producers who were offering him more money than he had ever seen in his life, said no. Not because he did not understand the risk, not because he failed to grasp what he was walking away from, but because Rocky Balboa was not a character to him. Rocky was the answer to every casting director who had ever looked at his face and found something wrong with it. Rocky was the thing he had been trying to say about himself for the entire decade he had spent being rejected in New York. And he was not going to hand that to someone else to say. The decision to turn down $350,000 when you have sold your dog for $25 is not the decision of a desperate man. It is the decision of a man who knows, with a clarity that most people never find, the precise difference between what something is worth and what someone is willing to pay for it. United Artists eventually agreed. Not enthusiastically, not without significant reservation about the risk they were taking on an unknown with a drooping face and slurred speech, but they agreed. Sylvester Stallone would write and star in Rocky for a fee of $35,000, a fraction of what they had offered him for the rights alone, with a production budget of $1 million, which in Hollywood terms was barely enough to make a film that anyone would take seriously. He signed the deal, and the first thing he did afterward was not celebrate, not call anyone, not allow himself even a moment of relief at what he had just secured. The first thing Sylvester Stallone did after signing the deal that would change his life was go back to the liquor store on the corner and look for the man who had bought Butkus. He stood outside that store for 3 days, and when he finally found the man, he paid $15,000, $15,000 of the $35,000 he had just been paid, to get his dog back. Because some things have a price, and some things have a value, and Butkus was never a $25 dog. He was always a $15,000 dog. Sylvester Stallone had always known that. He had just needed the world to catch up. Rocky was filmed in 28 days. 28 days to shoot the film that everything he had turned down was now riding on. Every rejected offer, every closed door, every cold night in that apartment, every moment of doubt that he had refused to let become a decision. The budget was tight enough that some scenes were filmed guerrilla style on the streets of Philadelphia without permits, with Sylvester Stallone running through the actual streets of the city in the actual cold, because there was no money to do it any other way. He was not just the writer and the star. He was completely invested in every frame, because he understood better than anyone on that set what was at stake if it did not work. Rocky was released in November 1976. It became one of the highest-grossing films of the year. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards and won 3, including Best Picture and Best Director. It launched a franchise that would span decades and a career that would make Sylvester Stallone one of the most recognizable actors in the history of American cinema. The man who could not afford to heat his apartment, who had sold his dog for $25 on a street corner, who had turned down $350,000 because he understood the difference between a price and a value. That man had just made one of the most beloved films in American history. And he had done it in 28 days, on a $1 million budget, with a face and a voice that the industry had spent a decade telling him were wrong. Today, Sylvester Stallone is one of the most recognized actors and filmmakers in the history of American cinema. A career spanning 5 decades, a franchise that became a cultural institution, and a net worth estimated at over $400 million. Built by a man who could not afford food in 1975, who sold his dog for $25, who turned down $350,000 because he understood something about himself that the entire industry had spent a decade trying to talk him out of understanding. So what do we take from the story of Sylvester Stallone? What are the silent fortunes buried inside this story that most people walk right past without ever seeing? The first silent fortune is this: the moment you compromise what you are for what you are offered, you stop becoming what you were meant to be. Sylvester Stallone could have taken $350,000 and walked away from Rocky a wealthy man. He would have been comfortable. He would have been fine. And he would have spent the rest of his life watching someone else play the character he had written from the most honest place inside himself, knowing that he had traded who he was for what he was offered. That trade, once made, cannot be unmade. And most people who make it never fully recover from it. Not financially, but in the deeper sense of knowing who they were supposed to become and choosing not to find out. The second silent fortune is this: the thing that makes you different is almost always the thing they tell you is the problem. Sylvester Stallone's face, his voice, the slurred speech that came from nerve damage at birth. These were the specific reasons casting directors gave for closing their doors on him for an entire decade. And those exact things, that face, that voice, that look, became the most recognizable elements of Rocky Balboa, the most beloved underdog character in the history of American film. The thing they rejected him for became the thing that made the film work. It was never a liability. It was always the asset. They just could not see it. And for a long time, they almost convinced him they were right. And the third silent fortune, the one most people never talk about, is this: knowing the difference between a price and a value is the most important financial and personal decision any man will ever make. $350,000 was the price. Rocky was the value. And Sylvester Stallone knew the difference when he had $25 to his name and a cold apartment and a dog he had just given away to a stranger. Most people never develop that clarity. Most people, understandably, reasonably, completely humanly, take the price when it is high enough, because the price is certain and the value is not. Sylvester Stallone held out for the value when every rational argument in the world was telling him to take the check. And if you have ever been offered a price for something you know is worth far more, a job that pays well but costs you everything else, an opportunity that solves one problem while killing something more important, his story is proof that holding out for the value is the hardest decision you will ever make. And the most important one. The man who sold his dog for $25 on a street corner in New York City went back to that same corner 3 days after signing his deal and waited until he found the man who had bought Butkus. And he paid $15,000 to get him back. That is the full circle. That is what holding out for the value instead of accepting the price looks like when it is real and not theoretical. Not a motivational quote on a wall, but a man standing outside a liquor store for 3 days with $15,000 because he always knew what his dog was actually worth, and now he finally had the means to pay it. Sylvester Stallone never forgot the distance between $25 and $15,000, and he never forgot what it cost him to know the difference. So here is the question I want to leave you with today, and I want you to answer it honestly in the comments below. If you had been sitting across that table in 1975, no food money, no heating, your dog already gone, and $350,000 being offered to you right now, would you have taken it? Not the version of yourself you want to be. The version you actually are, today, with everything you are carrying. Tell me honestly in the comments below. If Sylvester Stallone's story gave you something today, a lesson, a perspective, a reason to look differently at what you are holding on to and what you are being offered for it, subscribe to The Silent Fortunes. Because every single week we come back here and uncover another story the world forgot to tell. Another man, another decision, another moment when everything was on the line and what happened next changed everything.